Hello students, in this video we are going to learn about the queen versus pawn. When opponent's pawn is on the second rank or the 7th rank, and in the next move opponent is going to make a queen. What will be the result of this position? Is white winning or is the game a draw? Well, it depends on the position of the passed pawn. If the passed pawn is on certain files, then the game will be a win, and if the passed pawn is on certain files, then the game will end in a draw. This is what we are going to learn in today's video. If the pawn is on the D file or on the B file, and similarly if the pawn is on the E file or on the G file, then the queen wins the game. Then the white will win the game. But if the pawn is on these files, A pawn, A file, C file, F file or H file, then the game will end in a draw. Let's see how. Now it is white to move, and first step is to bring the queen closer to the pawn. So white starts with checks, queen C7 check, and he plays queen D6 attacking the pawn, so black defends it, and he again gives a check. Again he gives a check, queen C4 check. So slowly white brought his queen from far away to near the pawn. Black again plays king B2, king B2, and now white attacks the pawn from the behind. This is important. White plays queen D3, white is attacking the pawn from the behind, and black has only one choice to protect the pawn. And now you play queen C3 check. Now you are forcing the black king to go here, because if black plays king to B1, you will simply capture the pawn and it's a winning position. So when you are giving a check, you are forcing the black king to step in front of the pawn. And now the king is in front of the pawn. So in the next move, black cannot make a queen. And that's why white has the time to improve his king. White's goal is to bring his king to here, E3, to attack this pawn, or maybe to here on D3 to attack this pawn. If white can bring his king to D3 or E3 to attack the pawn, then white will win the game. And now white has the chance. White has one move to bring his king toward the pawn. So he plays king G7, and black plays king E2. He's threatening to make a queen. So you cannot improve your king. So you have to give checks with your queen. Or you can play queen C2. You are pinning this pawn. So your opponent cannot make a queen. So black plays king E1. He unpins the pawn. Now in the next move, again the threat is to make a queen. So you cannot bring your king closer. So you have to give checks. You give a check. King F2. And remember this idea. Attack the pawn from the behind. It will force the opponent to play king E1. And you give a check. Now this check, again king cannot go to F1 because you will capture the pawn. So king is forced to go to in front of the pawn. And once the king is in front of the pawn, then what do? You improve your king. King F6. So opponent plays king C2, and again you pin the pawn. Queen E2. You cannot let black make a queen, so you pin the pawn. King C1. Again give a check. King B2. Attack the pawn from the behind. It will force king C1, and you give a check. So again king is forced to go to D1. He cannot go to B1 because you will capture the pawn. So king D1. Now you have the time to bring your king closer. So this is how it works. You give checks, you force the opponent's king to go in front of the pawn. That will give you one move, and then you use that move to bring your king closer to the pawn. This is the winning plan. King E2, again you pin the pawn. King E1, you give checks. You attack the pawn from the behind, and you give another check, forcing the king to go to D1, and you bring your king forward. And let's say king C2, you again play queen to E2, pinning this pawn. King C1, same procedure. queen check, you attack the pawn from behind, you give this check, and you force the king to come to the in front of the pawn. And now you play king e3. Now your king has come closer from h8 to e3. Your king is closer to the pawn, you are attacking the pawn, that's the goal. And once the king moves, you capture the pawn. King f1, queen f2, checkmate. This is how you win this position. So if the pawn is on the d file, queen will win the game. Similarly, if you put the pawn on e file, then also queen will win the game. Now let's talk about the c file and the f file. If the pawn is on the c file, then the game ends in a draw. Why? You will see why. First, white plays in the same way. Okay, white brings his queen with checks. White wants to bring his queen closer to the pawn. So king a2, check, check, check. Okay, so he gives another check, king a2. Now he attacks the pawn from the behind as usual. It will force the opponent to play king b1, correct? And now you give a check, but this time opponent is not forced to go to king c1. Opponent can play king a1. Opponent can sacrifice this pawn and you cannot take it, because if you take this pawn, then it's a stalemate. That's why when the pawn is on the f file, when the pawn is on c file, or when the pawn is on f file, the game ends in a draw, because king can hide in the corner, and if queen takes the pawn, then it will be a stalemate. And if you don't take the pawn, then in the next move he is going to make a queen and you cannot stop it. If you play queen c3 check, again he will play king b1, he wants to make a queen. If you play queen d3, if you pin this pawn, then he will play king b2. If you again pin this pawn, he will play king b1. There is no way for you to force this king in front of the pawn. The only way is this: queen gives a check, you attack the pawn from the behind, then you give a check, and generally king has to go to c1, but here he can play king e1. So you have to capture the pawn and it ends in a stalemate, so the game is a draw. Now let's look at what happens when the pawn is on b file or when the pawn is on g file. If the pawn is on b file, then also white wins the game. So you know the first step, you have to bring your queen closer. King goes to b1, and now look, the king is already in front of the pawn. You don't need to give more checks, so you have the time to bring your king toward the pawn. So you play king g7. Opponent plays king c2, you give checks, more checks, more checks, and then you attack the pawn from the behind. It will force king c1. Now you play queen c3 check. Now king cannot play d2 because then you will capture the pawn. So king is forced to play king b1. He has to block his own pawn. So you have the time now to improve your king. You can improve the king. King a2, and again you play queen c2, king a1, you give check, force. Now the king is again in front of the pawn, so you improve your king. King c1, give check, you attack the pawn from the behind. King c1, you give check, forcing the king to b1, and again you have the time. So the process repeats. King a2, you pin the pawn, you give a check, and you play king c3. Now the king is closer to the pawn and he has only one choice, king c1. And here you just simply play queen c2 and it's a checkmate. So when the pawn is on b file or when the pawn is on g file, you use the same process and it will end in a win for you. Now let's look at what happens on the corner file. What if the pawn is on the a file or on the h file? If the pawn is on the a file or h file, then also game ends in a draw. Let's see why. You give checks, bring the queen closer, okay, and then you try to attack the pawn from the behind. King is forced to play king b1. You give a check, and now king is forced to move in front of the pawn. But now you cannot improve your king. Why? Because it's a stalemate. That's why when the pawn is on a file or h file, the game ends in a draw. So now you know the result of these kind of positions. If the pawn is on b file, d file, e file or g file, queen will capture the pawn and you will win the game. But if the pawn is on a file, c file, f file or h file, the game will end in a draw because of the stalemate. I hope you found this video instructive. Now it's time to go to the next video.